A woman living alone in a remote cabin hears a strange scratching at her door during the dead of winter. When she peeks through the frosted window, her heart stops. A massive grizzly bear, barely clinging to life, is standing outside, its fur frozen, its breath shallow, and its eyes filled with something she never expected: desperation. What happens next will leave you speechless. Stay with us as we unveil a story of survival, trust, and an unimaginable bond between a woman and the wildest of creatures. But before we dive in, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. Sarah Martyr had chosen a life of solitude in the Alaskan wilderness after losing her husband 2 years ago. The remote cabin was her sanctuary, a place where she could grieve, heal, and exist far away from a world that once felt too heavy. Winter had set in hard this year. The howling winds rattled the wooden walls of her cabin, and the snowfall was relentless. She was used to seeing wildlife, moose crossing the frozen lake, foxes darting through the trees, and even the occasional grizzly bear at a distance. But never had one come this close. The night was brutally cold when she first heard it, a faint scratching against her front door. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then came a low, guttural sound. A growl. But not an aggressive one, a sound of exhaustion. Heart pounding, she grabbed the rifle from the rack above her fireplace and crept toward the door. Through the frost-covered window, she saw it, a massive grizzly bear. But something was wrong. Its fur was matted with ice, its body trembling violently. The creature wasn't roaring or baring its teeth. It was simply standing there, looking at her with hollow, desperate eyes. Sarah's fingers tightened on the door handle. Every instinct told her to stay inside, but something about the bear's condition pulled at her heart. It was freezing to death. She had a choice: leave the creature to nature's fate or take an unthinkable risk. And then, in the most unexpected way, the bear made its plea. It lowered itself, pressing one massive paw against the door, almost knocking. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. What should she do? She stood frozen, gripping the door handle so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The bear's massive paw was pressed against the wooden door, its claws lightly scraping the surface, not in aggression, but in what seemed like an act of pleading. Her heart pounded in her chest. Every survival instinct screamed at her to stay inside. She had lived in the wild long enough to know that grizzlies were unpredictable, powerful creatures. And yet, something about this one felt different. Its breath came in short, labored puffs, forming small clouds in the freezing night air. It swayed slightly, as if it were moments away from collapsing. The snow that clung to its fur had turned to ice. And for a brief second, Sarah felt something unexpected: pity. But helping a wild bear was insanity. If she opened that door, she might not live to see the morning. Still, she couldn't look away. The bear let out a low, tired groan, shifting its weight from one paw to another. Its dark eyes met hers through the frosted glass, and in them, Sarah saw something that made her breath hitch: fear. It was afraid. And it was dying. Sarah bit her lip so hard she tasted blood. Her mind raced through her limited options. If she ignored the bear, it would freeze to death before sunrise. If she scared it away, it might collapse somewhere in the woods, alone, forgotten. But if she let it in... She turned back to her fireplace, where the flames crackled softly, their warmth radiating through the room. She had enough firewood, enough food. But did she have enough courage? Taking a deep breath, she made her decision. She grabbed the thickest blanket she owned, wrapped it around her shoulders, and cautiously unlocked the door. The wooden panels creaked as she pulled it open just enough to step outside. The freezing wind hit her instantly, stealing the breath from her lungs. The bear barely reacted. It didn't growl. It didn't move aggressively. It just stood there, its massive frame trembling, its breath shallow. Sarah hesitated, then took one slow step forward. The bear swayed slightly, blinking sluggishly. It was barely holding on. Sarah took another step and slowly, carefully, extended her hand. She wasn't sure what she expected, but when the bear lowered its head slightly, as if in exhausted surrender, she knew she had made the right choice. Helping a wild bear went against every law of nature. But Sarah wasn't thinking about that now. She was thinking about survival, hers and his. With slow, deliberate movements, she backed toward the open door, motioning for the bear to follow. For a moment, nothing happened. The bear simply stared at her, its body swaying. Then, with a slow, painful movement, it took a step forward. Sarah's pulse pounded as the bear entered the threshold of her home, its massive frame barely fitting through the door, its fur brushing against the wall. She stepped aside, pressing herself against the wooden panels as the bear stumbled inside. And then, as if the last of its strength had finally drained, the grizzly collapsed onto the wooden floor. Sarah jumped, her heart in her throat. The bear lay still, its chest rising and falling weakly. For the first time in her life, Sarah found herself sharing a space with one of the most feared predators in the wild. And she had just invited it in. Her home, she stared at the bear, the firelight flickering across its thick fur. What had she just done? Was this the beginning of something extraordinary, or had she just sealed her fate? The chapter ends with Sarah staring at the bear, her breath caught between fear and anticipation. The bear lay motionless on the wooden floor, its massive body barely fitting in the confined space of Sarah's cabin. The firelight flickered against its thick fur, melting the ice that clung to its body. Small droplets of water pooled beneath it as the warmth began to thaw its frozen coat. Sarah stood near the door, her pulse hammering in her ears. Her rifle was still within reach, resting on the counter. She had brought a wild grizzly into her home. What had she been thinking? She had no experience treating animals, let alone an apex predator. If the bear recovered and turned violent, she wouldn't stand a chance. Yet, she couldn't ignore the fact that it had done nothing aggressive. It could have swiped at her the moment she opened the door. It could have charged inside in a frenzy. Instead, it had collapsed, completely defenseless. Sarah took a shaky step forward, watching the bear's chest rise and fall in slow, labored breaths. It was alive, but for how much longer? She cautiously moved toward it, her breath shallow. The closer she got, the more she noticed details she had missed in the chaos. Its fur was tangled and rough, as if it had been struggling for weeks. Its paws were cracked and raw from the frozen ground. And worst of all, there was a deep gash running down its left shoulder, hidden beneath thick, matted fur. Sarah's stomach tightened. Had it been attacked by another bear? By wolves? Or worse, by humans? She grabbed a clean towel from a cabinet and soaked it in warm water. Kneeling beside the bear, she hesitated. If she touched it, would it lash out? Taking a deep breath, she pressed the warm towel against its wound. The bear let out a soft, rumbling groan but didn't move. She whispered almost instinctively. The bear's eyes locked onto Sarah's, and time seemed to freeze. Its dark, intelligent gaze bore into her, filled with an unreadable mixture of pain, confusion, and something Sarah hadn't expected, awareness. Her fingers gripped the armrest of the chair, her breath shallow and uneven. The rifle was still resting on the counter several steps away. If the bear decided to attack, she wouldn't have time to reach it. For what felt like an eternity, neither of them moved. The only sound in the cabin was the soft crackling of the fire and the bear's deep, rhythmic breathing. Then, as if deciding she wasn't a threat, the bear let out a low, rumbling sigh and lowered its head. Sarah exhaled sharply, realizing she'd been holding her breath. Over the next few days, Sarah and the bear settled into an unspoken routine. The bear rarely moved, its injured leg keeping it grounded near the fire. Sarah continued cleaning the wound, careful not to agitate the animal. Each time she approached, she spoke in soft, calming tones. "I don't know why you came to me," she said one evening as she dabbed the gash on its shoulder. "But I'm glad you did." The bear huffed softly in response, its eyes closing as if it understood her words. When Sarah wasn't tending to the bear, she gathered firewood, prepared meals, and kept an eye on the weather. The storm that had battered the wilderness was finally easing, but the snow was still deep, and the roads were impassable. As the days passed, Sarah found herself talking to the bear more often. She told it about her late husband, James, and how they had dreamed of living off the grid. She talked about the loneliness that had crept in since his passing and how the cabin had become both her sanctuary and her prison. The bear listened silently, its presence oddly comforting. One night, as Sarah dozed off by the fire, she was startled awake by a sharp scraping sound. Her eyes flew open, and her heart jumped into her throat. The bear was standing. Its massive frame loomed over her, and for a moment, panic gripped her. The firelight danced across its fur, casting long shadows on the walls. The bear took a step forward, its injured leg dragging slightly. Sarah froze, unsure of what to do. "Easy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm not going to hurt you." The bear sniffed the air, then turned its head toward the door. It let out a low, guttural growl, its ears flattening against its head. Sarah followed its gaze and saw what had caught its attention, movement outside the window. A shadow passed across the frosted glass. Grabbing the rifle, Sarah crept toward the window, her heart pounding. She wiped the frost from the glass and peered outside. At first, she saw nothing but snow-covered trees. But then, just beyond the clearing, she spotted them. Wolves. A pack of 3, their lean bodies moving silently through the snow, their yellow eyes glowing in the dim light. Sarah's grip on the rifle tightened. Wolves rarely approached cabins, but the scent of the bear might have drawn them closer. The bear growled again, a deep, rumbling sound that sent vibrations through the floor. It limped toward the door, its massive body tense and ready. "No," Sarah said firmly, stepping in front of it. "You're in no condition to fight." The bear looked at her, its dark eyes narrowing. For a moment, she wondered if it would push past her. But then, it hesitated, its growl fading. Sarah's mind raced. If the wolves attacked, the bear was too weak to defend itself, and she couldn't take on 3 predators alone. She threw more logs onto the fire, hoping the flames would deter the wolves. Then, grabbing a pot from the stove, she banged it loudly against the wall. "Go on. Get out of here," she shouted. The wolves stopped at the edge of the clearing, their ears twitching. One of them let out a low, eerie howl, and the others followed suit. Sarah's stomach churned. She knew they were testing her, waiting for an opportunity. The bear moved closer to her, its shoulder brushing against her arm. The contact sent a jolt through her, but instead of fear, she felt something else: solidarity. They were in this together. After what felt like hours, the wolves finally turned and slinked back into the woods. Sarah watched them disappear into the shadows, her body trembling with relief. She leaned against the door, clutching her chest, her breath unsteady. The bear let out a deep exhale, its body relaxing slightly. For the first time since that fateful night, Sarah realized something profound. She wasn't just protecting the bear. They were protecting each other. The rifle, the bear let out a low huff and sank back onto the floor, its body sagging with exhaustion. Sarah knelt beside it, her hand resting gently on its fur. "We did it," she whispered. "We kept each other safe." For the first time since the bear had arrived, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Their bond, fragile as it was, had grown stronger. But she knew this was just the beginning. The wilderness was unforgiving, and their fight for survival wasn't over yet. The morning after the wolf encounter, the cabin was eerily quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket of snow that glistened in the pale sunlight. Sarah stood by the window, staring out at the endless expanse of white. The bear lay near the fire, its breathing steady but its energy clearly drained. She couldn't shake the thought of the wolves. Why had they been so persistent? It wasn't normal for them to linger near humans for so long. Her curiosity got the better of her. Wrapping herself in her thick coat, she grabbed her rifle and stepped outside, the icy air stinging her cheeks. The snow crunched under her boots as she followed the wolves' tracks, which led toward the forest's edge. The tracks stopped abruptly near a cluster of pine trees. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she saw what the wolves had been after. A smaller grizzly bear lay partially buried in the snow, its body lifeless and its fur coated in frost. It was a cub. Sarah's stomach churned as she crouched beside it, her gloved hand brushing snow from its face. The cub's eyes were closed, its small body still and cold. It couldn't have been more than a few months old. And then it hit her. The bear in her cabin, it wasn't just a wandering predator. It was a mother. The wolves hadn't been after her. They had been hunting her cubs. Sarah stood frozen, the weight of the realization crashing over her. She thought back to the moment the bear had appeared at her door, its hollow eyes, its trembling body, its desperate plea. It had been searching for help. She glanced back toward the cabin, where the mother bear was resting. "You lost them," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She knew the pain of loss all too well. She had lost James, her husband, and the grief had nearly consumed her. Now, she understood the silent agony behind the bear's eyes. This wasn't just a wild animal. It was a grieving mother. When Sarah returned, the bear was awake, its dark eyes following her as she stepped inside. She set the rifle down and crouched near the fire, meeting its gaze. "I saw your cub," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry." The bear didn't move, but there was something in its expression that made Sarah feel as though it understood her. Over the next few hours, Sarah busied herself with chores, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the cub. She wondered if there had been others, if this mother had lost her entire family. As she worked, she couldn't help but talk to the bear. "You're stronger than I could ever be," she said, her voice breaking. "You've been through so much, and yet you're still here." The bear let out a low huff, its eyes closing as if in acknowledgement. That evening, Sarah sat by the fire, the cabin filled with a quiet warmth. She stared at the bear, its massive body stretched out on the floor, and felt a strange sense of resolve. She had spent so much time running from her own pain, isolating herself in the wilderness to escape the world. But this bear, this grieving mother, had faced unimaginable loss and still fought to survive. It reminded Sarah of something James used to say. "We're all stronger than we think. Sometimes we just need someone to believe in us." In that moment, Sarah made a decision. She wasn't going to just let the bear heal and leave. She was going to help it find its way back to the wild. The next morning, Sarah began making preparations. She packed supplies, checked the maps, and planned a route that would take them to a nearby wildlife sanctuary. It was miles away, but it was the best chance the bear had for survival. She wasn't sure if the bear would follow her, but she had to try. As she worked, the bear watched her intently, its dark eyes filled with quiet intelligence. "We're going to get through this," Sarah said, more to herself than to the bear. Together. The chapter ends with Sarah standing at the threshold of the cabin, staring out at the vast, snow-covered wilderness. She knew the journey ahead would be dangerous, but for the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose. The morning was bitterly cold as Sarah secured her pack and prepared for the journey. The snow was deep, and the path ahead would be treacherous, but she couldn't let the bear linger in the cabin any longer. It needed to return to the wild, where it truly belonged. The mother bear stood by the fire, its massive frame filling the small room. Its injured leg was still weak, but it had regained enough strength to move steadily. Sarah wasn't sure if it understood her plan, but it had been watching her intently all morning as she packed supplies and studied the map. "Ready, big girl?" Sarah asked, her voice both steady and uncertain. The bear let out a low rumble, as if in response. Sarah opened the door, and the icy wind rushed in, cutting through the warmth of the cabin. She stepped outside, the bear following close behind. The forest was eerily silent, the snow absorbing all sound except for the crunch of their footsteps. Sarah led the way, glancing back every few minutes to make sure the bear was keeping up. The wildlife sanctuary was miles away, and the trek would take at least 2 days if the weather held. But Sarah was determined. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, Sarah marveled at the bear's resilience. Resilience. Despite its injury, it trudged through the snow with a quiet determination. Watching it, Sarah felt a surge of admiration. "You're tougher than I am," she muttered, half smiling. The bear huffed softly, and Sarah couldn't help but laugh. By midday, the sun had begun to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the snow. Sarah's legs ached, and the cold was beginning to seep into her bones. She scanned the horizon, searching for a suitable place to camp. That's when she heard it, a distant, guttural growl. Her heart froze. Turning slowly, she saw movement in the distance. Wolves. The same pack from before. Their lean bodies wove through the trees. This time, there were more of them. 6, maybe 7. The mother bear stopped, its ears perking up, and let out a deep, rumbling growl that echoed through the forest. The wolves halted for a moment, their yellow eyes glinting in the fading light. Sarah gripped her rifle tightly. "Not again," she whispered, her breath visible in the frigid air. The wolves began to circle, their movements slow and deliberate. Sarah's pulse quickened as she realized they weren't going to back down. The mother bear took a step forward, planting itself between Sarah and the wolves. Its growl deepened, a powerful warning that reverberated through the trees. One of the wolves lunged, but the bear swiped at it with a massive paw, sending it tumbling into the snow. The others hesitated, their ears flattening. Sarah raised her rifle, aiming toward the pack. "Get out of here," she shouted, firing a warning shot into the air. The crack of the rifle echoed, and the wolves paused, their heads snapping toward her. For a moment, everything was still. And then, in unison, the wolves retreated, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. Sarah lowered the rifle, her hands trembling as the wolves' howls faded into the distance. She turned to the bear. It stood tall, its breath visible in the cold air, its dark eyes scanning the trees. "Thank you," Sarah said softly, her voice thick with emotion. The bear turned its head toward her, and for a brief moment their eyes met. In that gaze, Sarah saw something she couldn't quite explain, a mixture of trust, gratitude, and understanding. It wasn't just a wild animal anymore. It was a partner. A survivor. A symbol of resilience. As night fell, Sarah set up a small camp near the edge of a frozen river. The bear lay nearby, its body curled protectively around itself. Sarah sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The day's events played over and over in her mind, the wolves, the bear's unwavering bravery, and the bond they had formed. She thought of James, her husband, and the words he used to say when life felt overwhelming. "Sometimes we don't get to choose our battles, but we always get to choose how we face them." Looking at the bear, Sarah realized how true those words were. She hadn't chosen this journey, but she had faced it head-on. And for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. The chapter ends with Sarah lying beneath the stars, the bear's steady breathing lulling her to sleep. The wilderness around them was vast and unforgiving, but they had found strength in each other. The next morning, the air was crisp and still, the forest bathed in the soft glow of sunrise. Sarah stirred from her makeshift camp, her body stiff from the cold but her heart steadied by a renewed sense of purpose. The bear was already awake, standing near the edge of the frozen river. It gazed out at the horizon, its massive frame silhouetted against the pale light. For a moment, Sarah just watched it, marveling at its quiet strength. This journey had been about more than just survival. It had been about trust, resilience, and finding a connection in the unlikeliest of places. The final stretch to the wildlife sanctuary wasn't far, but the terrain was steep and unforgiving. Sarah packed up the camp, shouldering her supplies with quiet determination. "Almost there," she said, glancing at the bear. The bear huffed softly, its injured leg dragging slightly as it followed her. The path wound through dense trees and icy slopes, but they pressed on together. When they reached the edge of a ridge, Sarah spotted it, a cluster of small buildings nestled in the valley below, smoke curling from a chimney. Relief flooded through her. "We made it," she whispered, her voice breaking. As they descended toward the sanctuary, Sarah felt a heaviness settle in her chest. This was where their journey together would end. The bear would be safe here, cared for by experts who could help it heal fully. But the thought of saying goodbye was almost unbearable. When they reached the sanctuary gates, a man in a green jacket stepped forward. He introduced himself as Ben, one of the rangers. His eyes widened when he saw the bear at Sarah's side. "This is incredible," Ben said, his voice filled with awe. "How did you manage to get it here?" Sarah smiled faintly. "We helped each other." Ben nodded, motioning for his team to prepare a tranquilizer. "We'll take it from here. You've done something remarkable." As the rangers approached, the bear turned to Sarah, its dark eyes meeting hers. It let out a low, soft growl, not of aggression, but of acknowledgement. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she reached out her hand, brushing against its thick fur. "You're going to be okay," she whispered. "You're stronger than you know." The bear huffed one last time before stepping forward, allowing the rangers to guide it into the sanctuary. Sarah stood there, watching until it disappeared from view. The walk back to the cabin felt quieter than before. The forest was the same, but something inside Sarah had shifted. She no longer felt the crushing weight of solitude. For so long, she had been consumed by her grief, retreating from the world and shutting herself off from connection. But this journey with the bear had shown her something she hadn't realized. Healing wasn't about forgetting the pain. It was about finding strength in spite of it. When Sarah finally reached her cabin, she lit a fire and sat by the window, staring out at the snowy landscape. The wilderness no longer felt like a prison. It felt alive, filled with possibility. And for the first time in years, Sarah felt truly at peace. Weeks later, Sarah received a letter from the sanctuary. The bear had recovered well and was on its way to being released back into the wild. Tears streamed down her face as she read the note. Her journey with the bear had ended, but its impact on her life would stay forever. She stood by the window, looking out at the horizon. Somewhere out there, the bear was finding its place again, just as she was. The chapter ends with Sarah stepping outside, the cold wind brushing against her face. She breathes in deeply, feeling the crisp air fill her lungs. Looking out at the vast wilderness, she whispers softly, "Thank you." Her voice carries into the quiet, a message of gratitude to the creature that had changed her life forever. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who believes in the power of resilience and connection. Together, let's celebrate the courage it takes to face the wild, both within and around us.